Okay, welcome back. We just can't do this anymore. Smaller congregations facing choice points, part 2. So one question that came in from the morning had to do with mission and purpose. And perhaps it went something like, don't you have to start out by clarifying mission and purpose? And as I think you would tell me if I asked you this question, you would say, no matter what you're doing, you need to know what your purpose is. And even if your mission is being faithful to the end and ending well, that's a perfectly good mission. And then you'll have some criteria. What would be the hallmarks of a good ending? And you'll have 3 or 4 things. And we're going to try to live it that way, okay? Another thing I want to say about mission and purpose, and this is something I was really allergic to in my early training and teaching about strategic planning, was the presumption that the first thing you have to do is write a mission statement. And that actually can be the deadliest and driest of everything involved in strategic planning or discernment. Not because it's not the right thing conceptually, but because we often come out of outer space when we're having those conversations and we're totally in our heads and we're into commas and semicolons and it's just dead. It often doesn't have reality, it doesn't have life, and it can be very boring. But one of the things over the years I've discovered and tried to convey to others is that this is a cyclical process, not a linear one. And even if you're asking a question about which plumber to hire, it may still raise questions about purpose. Are we looking for somebody to keep it fixed for another year before we renovate the bathroom? And the reason we would renovate the bathroom is because we want to bring in that nursery school program that we're going to try to connect up with our ministry and some, it's not linear. And so I would suggest to you that in the process of talking about options and all the nitty-gritty and arguments and so forth that will naturally be part of that, you could just step back and say, so what does this tell us about our mission now? What does it tell us about our purpose now? As we grapple with these logistics, what seem like logistics, why would we do one thing or another? And it often comes out as, what do we need to let go of in terms of our sense of mission, purpose, goals? And what do we need to hew to more closely in this stage of our ministry? Or to add, but to make central for the next stage. That all has to do with mission and purpose. So I definitely would underscore keeping mission and purpose part of the conversation, but being happy to return to that at any step where it seems like there's been some even fruitful disagreement may mean there's underlying disagreement about purpose. And what a great moment to talk about it, when there's actually energy about it and people have something to say about it. That's a good time to have that conversation. So, great. Did any other group surface a question or two?
I just have a question about what you just said.
A question about my just comment about mission and purpose, yeah. Yes.
So along with the mission and purpose comes this governance thing. When you were talking about periods, commas, and all that, the whole governance thing about every needs goals, you need to have profiles, all of this stuff. Are you suggesting that be simplified and watered down?
Am I suggesting that you simplify and water down your governance? Okay, I'm not going to cop to that. Now, I mean, governance matters, but governance is tactics.
Right.
And I would say there's a lot of places to start vital conversations. I've offered you a starting point of looking at options. If you take that starting point which is not going to be the right one for every single church at every single moment, right? But if it is, then as you narrow down choices and begin to explore, say, two that might seem most timely, at some point in that exploration, you'll want to ask yourself, what are the governance implications? And in that, I think you'll want to collaborate with your regional colleagues who will have experienced these questions in many places, probably already, and to get suggestions about, again, what do you want to keep in terms of the central values. Your governance in some ways reflects some central values about the centrality of the gospel and of the laos in constituting the church, if I were to put it in highfalutin terms. So you want to keep that. But does that mean you have to keep all of these particular rules? Or do you have to do governance according to this particular model? That's a really different question. And some of these strategies are going to require creative approaches to governance that are going to look different. So, you have to sit a little loosely with that as you're choosing options, but when you're really working on one, then you have to start to nail it down. How do we have a structure that is supportive and congruent with the mission and the path, the strategic path that God has called us into as best we can tell? Does that address your question? Okay, good. Is there another question in the room, perhaps? Yes, go ahead.
So there's, in some of the options that you gave, a lot of shame. Like there could be the experience of congregations that they feel shame and guilt for what they've let go of or what has stopped.
Uh-huh. The theme here is shame and guilt.
Yeah.
Yes.
So are there ways to make congregations more resilient?
Coping with shame and guilt and helping congregations be more resilient to bear what they need to let go of, what they need to face into, to fairly weigh their responsibility for what didn't go as they hoped. Maybe that'd be a way of putting it. As you well know from your personal life, our political life, your truth and reconciliation process here in Canada, and especially in BC, we're in a world saturated with shame and guilt. And saturated with challenges to our current self-understanding, our current presumptions, our current privilege, on down the list. This is an aside, but we have been doing some very intense, very beginning work about talking about racism in our own city, where that has just not been on the table ever. So what we're doing is baby steps, but they feel like climbing Mount Everest. And one of the things I find myself saying to myself, and then being kind of intentional as a participant leader in saying to others, is that for people who are white, identified as white, people who can identify that I am a person of privilege, and so on, the whole conversation can feel like an invitation to self-hatred, which is closely related to shame. And I want to say to people, most of the time the speaker is not asking that of me. Occasionally the speaker may be asking that of me. If they're angry enough and wounded enough, they may actually be asking me to hate myself, right? But it's up to me to decide how I'm going to receive this and what I'm going to do with it. And I choose not to receive it as self-hatred. And I try to say to others, you too could choose not to receive it as self-hatred, to receive it as information, moral information, And then you have to work through your own values, your own capacity for change. I mean, a whole list of things. You have to figure out where you're going to, and I find myself saying, I got to say, can I stand before God with me right now and be okay with the incompleteness of that, the brokenness of that? I mean, in a sense, that's what it comes down to, not to engage in self-hatred, but sort of accept one's humanness and one's acceptance before God as human. So it is something of that same spiritual work for congregations that are feeling they have failed. In some cases, they are feeling somebody else has failed them. And sometimes there is a large measure of truth in the damage they may have sustained, unacknowledged and unadjudicated abuse of various kinds, both of the familial and emotional and family system kind, and then of the larger, political, geopolitical kind that First Nations sustained, and others. So I don't know what the words will be for the particular place you're ministering. I'm trying to convey the spirit of what could be very empowering for people, because in that same bag with all the shame about apparent failure and or anger toward the person who failed us is probably a whole lot of other life material that also needs to be processed and that needs some lightening, some leavening with a word of hope, a word of forgiveness, a word of acceptance, and an invitation to actually believe the gospel again, that this is actually for me as well as for the other, and can lighten my load. The sort of come unto me, all ye that are heavy laden. You can tell I'm an Anglican. It turns up in a lot of Anglican liturgies, quite a lot. So whatever your resource is for entering that conversation with people, but I would heartily underline noticing shame, guilt, and blame, and trying to find supportive, graceful ways for people to think about what's happened and perhaps to see if they can reframe it for themselves. That even that violating minister is a child of God, which may be very tough to say. And to give probably examples from your own context. The big example right now in the States, and I don't know if it's gotten around international television or not, is this policewoman in Texas who just in a series of inattentive, careless, reckless, irresponsible behavior trying to get to her own apartment, landed at the doorstep of somebody on a different floor, same apartment, different floor, and found the door unlocked and pulled out her gun, and this gentleman who is African American, was African American, shot him. And that was just went through our court system. And she was convicted of murder. She got a lighter sentence than she might have, 10 years. And the brother of the man who was killed, in his victim testimony, his witness statement, asked the judge if he could hug this woman. And there was this long pause, and this very wonderful presence, this woman who's African American, who was the judge. And you could tell she took this deep breath, like, are we really going to do this? And she took the breath, and then she looked at this man who was clearly quite sincere in his own faith that brought him to that. And she said yes. And so, of course, the guard came up beside them, necessary for safety, of course. But this happened, and I think it has just been a stunning result. And there's a little queasiness on the one hand. Do we always expect African American people to be loving and forgiving and resilient? And boy, that's a burden nobody should have put on their shoulders involuntarily. And on the other hand, it speaks to the strength of the faith tradition that even in these horrible circumstances comes through. Right now, I can't remember how I got off on that because it's such an intensely, kind of personal topic for our country right now. But I guess I'm just wanting to say there's no help for it except going back to the gospel. And are we not deserving of, but recipients of God's love even in these circumstances and even in the worst distortions of our humanity? That doesn't mean people should not be held accountable. That's a different question, completely different question. And Christians get mixed up with that and think sometimes would say forgiveness means erasing accountability and restitution and punishment, in whatever that means in a particular culture. That's a different kind of question. But I'm sorry, that took me rather deep into my own feelings about the situations we face right now. But it's just as deep for where there has been real abuse in a congregation. The feelings are at least as deep as that. And then, then we have examples of just people who made mistakes that at some times were careless, at other times were honest mistakes. They really did do the best they could. They were really paying attention, and they did something that was really harmful. That happens to all of us, I think. So this is where your pastoral and proclamation skills are going to need to come to the fore in whatever is the language that you can best speak with the community that you're in.